Hey everyone, and welcome back to yet another year in review of the games I played. In 2023, I took a deep dive into the indie game scene, and the sheer variety reset my growing fatigue for the AAA games I had been sucked into for years. In 2024, I had a more balanced approach, and took the opportunity to mix in some more massive games I had missed in recent years, while still making time for the smaller experiences. I also wanted to quickly say thank you for the support on my video last year, since it is by far the most viewed video ever on my channel, and further inspired me to continue with making another one. So let's get into it. The first game I played in 2024 was Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. It is without a doubt the most popular on my list this past year, and I had been looking forward to it for a while, and it absolutely delivered in all the ways I wanted it to. The lack of handholding, the freedom of the sandbox, and the scale of the world led to an organic feeling of exploration and wonder that I hadn't felt in years of gaming. Whereas many open world games can overwhelm you with waypoints, Breath of the Wild encourages you to seek high ground and set your own path for adventure. And as you progress on your little adventures, you are met with a beautiful soundscape of music, ambience, and rewarding sound effects. The music is subtle and serene, fading in and out with gentle piano keys, or picking up the tempo for upbeat music in small villages. Yet you can rely on it to absolutely bring the intensity for epic boss fights as well. The ambient noise of birds chirping and gusts of wind also help reinforce this feeling of vastness in a world overgrown with nature. And lastly, a feeling that invokes strong nostalgia in me from watching my dad play Zelda as some of my earliest gaming memories was the noises that played when you opened a chest or discovered a temple. The game is also visually beautiful and has a good amount of variety to keep things fresh, as you move from forests to snowy mountains, magma caves, and a few more. Hyrule Forest in particular was so lush and dense it truly felt like I was walking through the set of a Ghibli movie. The last huge praise I will give to this game is the unbelievable variety of mechanics present in the different shrines you have to solve. There are enough unique gameplay challenges to fill several standard other games. The relentless creativity continued to impress me as dozens of hours in, after thinking I had seen it all, I was using my weapons to progress through a mini golf course, or using my controller as a gyroscope to steer a ball through a huge labyrinth maze. And what makes it all the more impressive is it truly feels like most puzzles have many solutions to approach it. I often came away from shrines feeling like I had somehow broken the game, but in reality I know it was likely just one of many ways to solve it. However, I did find a lot of these shrines a bit too simple. It seems many of them could introduce a mechanic and then the shrine was just done before it could expand on it in a meaningful way. While the variety is definitely enjoyable, I would have really preferred half as many shrines with more depth in each one, since most were just freebies without any intense problem solving needed. Now on to the other main criticisms I have of the game. Weapon durability is an easy one to dunk on that everyone goes for, and while it does make early game a bit frustrating as you hoard tons of crappy weapons to cycle through as they snap, I think it masks an even uglier problem that had me losing interest in playing the later parts of the game, and that is a lack of meaningful progression in your power as a player. Spending 30 minutes climbing a mountain, another 15 solving a puzzle, just to get a weapon with the same damage as the other 5 I'm hoarding doesn't feel great. It just feels like I'm carrying a backup. And the game's difficulty doesn't really demand that you seek out every shrine to increase your hearts or stamina. It takes 4 shrines to increase one of these attributes, and when you're in the early game with a sense of wonder, it goes by fast. Not to mention, an increase from 3 hearts to 4, 4 to 5 feels way more impactful than 12 to 13. This caused my motivation to crash hard with each hour I continued to put into the game after around 25 or so. A compounding factor to my growing apathy as I reached the late game was a total lack of interest in the story. It's been a year now, to be fair, as I write this, but I can only think of the names of 1 or 2 characters or remember any significant plot points beyond a handful of gimmicky moments. I was simply not invested because it felt like the same Zelda story I've seen so many times before. I know this isn't supposed to be a selling feature of the game, but I have to mention it because there are other games that I can continue to play because I'm motivated to at least see the ending from a narrative perspective. The combat is also just serviceable. It's not terrible, and there can be fun moments based on how you approach each encounter, but it's definitely not fun enough to have me thoroughly enjoying fighting mobs of low-tier enemies after progressing far into the game. I think a lot of my issues with this game could be solved if the experience was made to be a more short, compact version of itself, which is totally a personal preference. There are enough shrines to justify the runtime, but unfortunately, the surrounding gameplay systems just don't cut it for me. Despite these negatives, it's undeniably a masterclass in what it does in its open world aspects, and it nails a lot of what matters most in a Zelda game. For these reasons, I still look back fondly at the time I spent with this game, and won't forget the feeling of wonder I had exploring the lands of Hyrule. For that reason, I'm giving it an A. Palworld is a creature collector survival game that exploded onto the gaming scene out of seemingly nowhere. With a team of just a few dozen people, production handled on USB sticks, and a budget just a small fraction of what most AAA games take to make, this game shook the games industry to its core. It sold 25 million copies and made over $425 million, with a rating of very positive on Steam. The devs learned how to make a game on the job, and many assets were bought from cheap marketplace packs. So how is this possible, and what is the charm of Palworld? Catching Pokemon is really fun. I think that's a large part of it. The creature collector gameplay loop, wrapped up into a grindy survival style progression game, is highly addictive, even when it's pretty simple in most other aspects. I loved playing Pokemon games as a kid, but the lack of innovation and each game getting easier and easier eventually made me lose interest as I grew older. But Palworld felt like, again, I got to re-experience that nostalgia of exploring and getting excited to see new creatures I could catch. There's definitely a huge gap in this genre right now, and making it co-op was a no-brainer to draw in people for a fun time catching pals with their friends. I also have to give credit for the creative use of pals within your base that really makes them feel like more of a present part to your team in all aspects of gameplay, rather than just battle bots who sit in their pal spheres all day. Different creatures specializing in different tasks made for interesting side progression, since you would sometimes be hunting a pal not for its combat strength, but rather its mining efficiency or ability to chop down trees twice as fast. In addition to that, they also serve personal utility for exploration, like flying around the map, or even simple things like pulling out a fire type in a cave to let its flame illuminate your surroundings like a torch. One aspect I'm conflicted on is the sheer quantity of pals in the world that you can catch and use. The game rewards you for catching 10 of each type, and there are systems to fuse them together, and new stronger pals are so constant that sticking with an early game one to level up rarely seems like the best option. Because of this, my pals felt pretty disposable, and it was hard to develop an attachment to them in the same way I felt for my Pokemon growing up. Sticking with a weak Dratini for 55 levels to see it through to a Dragonite really makes you feel like they're a reliable part of your team that you had to invest into, and this didn't really happen with me during my time with Palworld. The surrounding polish of the game when I played at launch also just felt a bit amateurish. Some of the UIs were clunky, the art style is pretty generic, and the narrative elements were pretty forgettable. Ultimately though, what caused me to drop the game was that the growing amount of tasks was starting to become overwhelming to keep track of, and a lack of a strong forward direction left me with little motivation to continue. I have heard that the devs have been relentlessly updating the game, and I've heard great things about the patches and new content. If the core gameplay experience of catching pals sounds fun to you, then it likely will be. But outside of that special formula, there was nothing here truly remarkable to have it considered for years to come as a must-play game. For those reasons, I'm going to give it a B. Risk of Rain 2 is an incredibly fun and addicting third-person co-op action roguelike. There are 16 playable classes, each with an incredibly unique kit of combat and movement abilities to learn and master. Trying out new heroes and spending the time to become an expert at cycling their cooldowns and crafting new builds from the random upgrades around the map was an incredible source of entertainment. In Risk of Rain 2, you can unlock new heroes and abilities over time, but in general, most progression is lateral, and the majority of the improvements to your runs come from your better knowledge of the game and your skills increasing on each character. And when you've maxed your time on one, switching to another is so refreshing and keeps you playing for even longer. Part of the knowledge is just learning what each power-up does for you, as there are no tooltips, just icons. The first time you grab an ability, you get that gambling moment of hoping it's good that slowly shifts over time into the satisfying feeling of recognizing that item is exactly what you need to advance your build. And the builds are insane. The game is begging to be broken with dozens of overpowered combinations and a ridiculous amount of visual effects scattered across your screen. The game is also packed with interesting and challenging achievements, which allow you to unlock new characters and abilities, like getting 10 one-shot kills in a row, beating a level without being hit once, or landing 20 consecutive perfectly timed reloads, which all add small but enjoyable secondary objectives during your runs. And the soundtrack goes unbelievably hard, especially as you progress further into the later stages. It feels absolutely epic and otherworldly, and helps make boss fights truly cinematic. The bosses themselves are another area for praise, as lots of roguelikes bordering on a bullet hell might lack mechanics, but Risk of Rain bosses had interesting and brutal movesets that had me at times feeling like I was playing an arcade take on a Souls-like in those brief moments. The last bit of praise I want to give to the game is that it felt great in a group, balancing your team composition for co-op play to cover different utilities like a ranged sniper, up-close shotgunner, and communicating how to distribute the abilities as they spawned on the map for optimal synergy was very satisfying. Now on to a few negatives, and I think the biggest one to me is the absolutely crushing time commitment needed for a long run. I don't think this is inherently something that should be fixed in the game, but something that has to be mentioned and can make it hard to jump into a quick session. Some play sessions easily taking up to or over an hour just to lose can be pretty disheartening. I will say, it helps make it addicting because it makes you really want to jump back in, but a lack of save points makes it a trickier rogue style game to just squeeze in a quick run like so many others in the genre. Co-op play also has no revive mechanic, which leads to moments where players can be waiting 10 plus minutes dead on a level until it's beaten by their teammates and they can respawn. And then after having missed a full stage of upgrades, they are more likely to die again and continue spectating other players, which can be pretty unfun over a long run. Another one is that I think the raw memorization of abilities asks just a bit too much of the player for every item. When I played, there were 186 unique items, and after 10 hours of gameplay, I felt comfortable with maybe 15% of them. I ended up just playing with diagrams on my second monitor, asking my friends, and eventually caving in and downloading a mod to display item descriptions in the game. I would have really liked if there was some in-game way to unlock these names or item tips. Maybe completing a run with 10 stacks of an item unlocks the description or something along those lines. It would add another good loot chase and remove what was, in my opinion, a frustrating aspect of the game. I felt like I should be using flashcards outside of the game to memorize better in the game, which shouldn't be the case. Also, I can't finish this review without addressing the latest expansion, Seekers of the Storm, which is currently sitting at mostly negative on Steam. This is unexpected considering the very positive for the base game. I haven't played it myself, but reviews described it as underwhelming in terms of the new survivors, items, and some bugginess that was introduced into the game. I haven't tried it myself, so I can't speak much more, but I hope and believe it would take a lot more to remove the entertainment value from this base game. Despite these flaws, I feel confident putting Risk of Rain 2 in the S tier, as the gameplay delivered on exactly what I would want from this style of game, and I had a ton of fun playing this. Helldivers 2 is a squad PvE shooter that takes you and your team to nightmarish planets to fight hordes of enemies and spread democracy. The game definitely has some appealing aspects, but ultimately couldn't keep me entertained past about a dozen hours. Starting with the positives, one thing that stuck out early was the tone and humor of the game. Being able to name my warship Advocate of Family Values was ridiculous, and hearing our characters yell outlandish lines like "Say hello to democracy" rarely got old. The visual setting was also really great and uniquely hellish. The abundance of VFX for all your tactical equipment kept the horizon dense with beautiful explosions. The constant storms and heavy weather also made for intense cinematic moments as your team advanced through the hostile terrain together. And little things like an arrow key sequence to call in your stratagems help push the immersion just a bit further in a fun way. However, while I played Helldivers, a few things constantly annoyed me. Reloading was terrible in general. The UI and progress bar confused me and everything interrupted it. Crouching, jumping, swapping, flinching, and the game doesn't try to continue auto-loading, so you have to restart the animation manually every time. I also found the movement pretty clunky as well. Spamming dolphin dives to clip out of hitboxes felt gimmicky, and stun locks from enemy attacks were simply infuriating. But ultimately, the biggest thing that caused me to lose all steam with Helldivers was there was a lack of clear goal for progression. What am I grinding for? Lots of the best items were unlockable early on, and while I can appreciate a bit of lateral progression, sometimes it felt like I could play several missions without feeling any substantial increase in power to my kit. And the only incentive to increase my power to begin with is to play the same mission at a higher level, which to me is so uninteresting. If this game had more steady and intuitive progression, with late game levels that had a change in settings, new mechanics, new enemies, I would have likely pushed on further than I did. In another game from the looter shooter genre like Destiny, I am encouraged to grind through the simpler repetitive content like strikes because I know there's a fantastic raid at the end of the tunnel, not just a strike on a higher level. I think I might be an outlier here, as many people were able to enjoy this game for longer than I did, but for me, the gameplay was equal parts fun and frustrating, and the long-term goals lacked depth, so I'm giving it a C. The Finals is a destruction PvP game that I played last year and gave an A ranking for its great take on what a competitive game could be that borrows and combines great qualities from so many before it. And it absolutely started strong when I returned to it for Season 2 in 2024. They put a delay on the defib, removed recon, and nerfed the C4s on canisters, which were all impactful and welcome changes. The cyber aesthetic was also pretty neat and a cool direction artistically. Along with the update came new gadgets fitting the theme like the anti-grav zone and portal, which were balanced but shook up the existing sandbox. However, the ranked system completely destroyed any desire I had to play this game. I know I'm being a massive armchair dev here, but I don't understand how in 2024 people are creating ranked systems that are so frustrating and unsatisfying to play. Here's your warning now that the rest of this review is just a rant on ranked that serves as a proxy for my frustrations with not just the Finals, but a lot of games that have similar issues. In Season 1, it launched with ranked being a linear progression that was barely representative of skill, but more so of the time you put into the game. If I were to play 10 matches as a highly skilled player, I would be playing extremely difficult matches from the beginning due to skill-based matchmaking, while remaining near the bottom of the ranked ladder. By comparison, a weaker player could play 30 matches in much lower skill lobbies while climbing his way to a more respectable rank. And the worst part is that the ranks of other players in the lobbies are hidden the whole time. I am lost as to how this is an acceptable practice, and I have to imagine its greatest strength is to hide bad matchmaking and wide rank disparity. There was one game where I was in gold and my two friends were in silver. We got absolutely destroyed by a player with TTV in their name. So I decided to pull up their stream and saw that they were not only diamond, but ranked 300 in the world. If I was playing a sport and absolutely loved it, let's say basketball for an example, but every week I had to play NBA players pretending to be my age and skill level, I would simply stop playing, regardless of my enjoyment for the game, which is just sad to see so much potential wasted. Season 2 came with positives and negatives, first being rank transparency. Okay, great. Now at least I know I'm playing enemies 2 full ranks above me. This simply does not happen in other games. In Rocket League, as a diamond player, I only ever match other diamond players. What is the point of ranked if I queue as a bronze and lose to a team of golds? I have to assume there is either hidden skill-based matchmaking way out of sync with my rank, or the restrictions for lobby balancing are way too relaxed. The next major issue was a lack of post-game progression. The first season at least had fame points, which you could watch go up or fall down based on your performance in the last tournament. But now, more often than not, you see nothing happen, as your rank moves in larger hidden increments. There was a time I played 10 tournaments and didn't see my rank change once. Now, if I went up, down, down, and back to the same rank after 10, that's actually fine, because at least I feel rewarded for a good game and punished for a bad one. But the lack of feedback for my performance is just not a satisfying experience. I haven't played the Finals in a long time now, not since early 2024, so there could be significant improvements to the playlist systems by now. Who knows, I might even revisit it in 2025. I still fondly remember playing it early on and loving the gameplay, so it's really hard to give a low rank. If you listen to my review from last year, it's 90% praise, so even though this year was mostly a negative emphasis, it's hard to be fair and give it below a B. It looks great and it plays great. I really hope it can find its footing and become a long-running game with a core audience, similar to Rainbow Six Siege. A Short Hike is a cute, relaxing adventure game where you play as a bird trying to reach the top of a mountain for some cell phone reception. One of my first notes on this game as I was playing just says, "It immediately made me feel good." I'm sure many of you have seen memes about finishing a frustrating day at work just to boot up the most frustrating game you know, and experiencing a short hike is the total opposite of that. The art is simple but pleasant and colorful. From the patterns of waves in the water to the swaying of the trees, everything has a soothing effect as you explore the island. A visual effect I particularly enjoyed was how places in the distance would fade to beige if you got high enough to look at them from a faraway place. The music is uplifting, the sound effects are fun, and the movement is surprisingly smooth for a game that definitely isn't focused on its movement mechanics. But most important and enjoyable to me was the writing. I got to experience dozens of small, charming encounters that ranged from genuinely funny to relatable and meaningful, all emphasizing the themes of the game and anxiety. A Short Hike can be beaten in under 2 hours, and this shorter runtime was another aspect I appreciated, as the game knew its strengths, what it wanted to do, and showed them off, then wrapped it up before you could get tired of any parts of it. I'll leave you with one of my favorite lines from the game, which I think summarizes its themes and how I feel about it. You encounter a painter who is endlessly frustrated with their work and clearly having confidence issues. They say, "I can't use this. I'm not bringing anything new to the table. I want people to feel something when they look at my work." To which you, the player, respond, "But I do feel something. When I look at it, it makes me happy. It's a simple game, but for its goals and its runtime, I couldn't have asked for more. So for that, I'm giving it an A. Dave the Diver is a casual management adventure game that is trying to be a lot of different things. I think the game has a lot of charm and finds success in many aspects, but ultimately spreads itself a bit too thin for me. Early on, you were introduced to these transition animations, which are used for narrative sections of the game, and they are always very entertaining. The writing in general is pretty consistently funny and sets a tone from the beginning that it doesn't take itself too seriously. The blended 2D 3D art style between the characters and the environments works really well. The environment styles also start to get creepier as you dive deeper to match the lethality of the new creatures you find. The music is super chill and catchy, perfectly matching the vibe of the game itself. Dave the Diver has a lot of mechanics, but the opening does a really good job of introducing you to them without feeling overwhelmed. And early on, there are enough parallel aspects of progression to continually deliver that rewarding feeling as you dive a bit deeper, carry more items, take more damage, etc. Last year I talked about Moonlighter, which had a similar gameplay loop in the sense that you dungeon crawl for items, then return to your shop and sell them. I had problems with the shop component since it wasn't as engaging as I would have liked it to be. In Dave the Diver, when you return to your shop to sell your ingredients as sushi, the gameplay is simple but engaging enough to demand your attention and never feel like a chore. You have to manage your sprint, and there are little QuickTime events like pouring a perfect cup of tea to increase your tips from customers. There are minimal deadlines in the game as well, and the diving loops are pretty short, which makes it a very easy game to get addicted to for that one more run factor and never too much pressure. Over time, the diving gameplay got a bit boring to me, however, as there wasn't much meaningful randomization to the tools you could find each run. The expression of skills also limited, and I felt like I wasn't really improving my abilities much, just grinding for slightly better upgrades. Which is a shame, because I feel like some more gameplay altering equipment each run and a bit more timing required for the fishing could have easily made the roguelike appeal much stronger. However, around 15 hours the game almost entirely pivots its genre and lost me completely, as it halts progression and devolves into fetch quests. The narrative of the game starts mysterious and intriguing, but gets muddy without much strong messaging. When they introduced seahorse racing as the new minigame, I lost hope of the game getting back on track in any meaningful way. I would have much rather seen a few of the minigames cut out in exchange for a bit more depth in the existing gameplay loops. I really enjoyed my first 10-ish hours with Dave the Diver, and again, I think the game does more than a competent job in many ways. However, it lacked focus and the directional pivots were unable to keep me hooked to the end, so I'm giving it a weak B. Horizon Forbidden West is an open-world action RPG and the sequel to the critically acclaimed Horizon Zero Dawn from back in 2017. After playing lots of indies, smaller budget and stylized games, the first thing that struck me was the absolutely stunning high-fidelity art. The density of detail in every environment, and especially the foliage, is so damn impressive. The lighting is natural yet cinematic, and the world feels saturated and colorful but still grounded enough to be believable. Jumping into a PS5 game again also made me appreciate the tactile feedback from the rumbling controller and the trigger clicks. There's also something really immersive with having secondary detail audio coming from your controller as well as your TV. And just like the first game, they've really stumbled onto a satisfying formula for combat with breaking pieces off of enemies. It makes fights so strategic and engaging when every shot you take is a tactical decision. Some areas you can break off for extra loot, some will deal massive damage but break components you might want to scavenge. And sometimes you're shooting weapons off the enemies to pick them up and use it against them, which is so fun. The difficulty level feels great as well, and actually forces you to make use of your extended utility and heavily rewarding pre-fight setup with traps. Matching your gear based on their resistances and the encounter you're taking on also felt really impactful. Only two aspects of combat really stood out to me as weaker, and the first was the option of stealth. It just seemed a bit too strong compared to the balancing of standard combat at times. Clearing out a whole camp of enemies with one-shots that would usually take 4 hits and 3 arrows encouraged stealth play heavily, which I don't mind too much, but I simply found active combat much more fun, and in the early game it felt like I was being punished a bit for choosing this playstyle. And the other thing is the post-fight looting, which is way too important in terms of progression to be as frustrating as it was. A big fight could take several minutes and span over so much distance that by the time it's wrapped up and you're on to scavenging, it can be a nightmare to track down all the components. Pieces would roll down hills, be hidden in bushes, and while the scanner helps, I found it was too short-ranged and sometimes accepted I won't find the important valuable I need and just left the scene annoyed. Another area that fell a bit short was some of the cutscenes and dialogue. It honestly seems like it may be a technical technical limitation of the open world genre at this point, but being a Sony blockbuster game, I naturally want to compare it to other titles like God of War or The Last of Us, and the quality level just isn't there sometimes for these story moments. Animations felt stiff or janky, with some cheesy lines that took me out of the moment. In general, I found the story less interesting than the first. It was still a cool sci-fi adventure, but the mystery of the first game I found to be much more intriguing. One persistent plot point that bothered me was having the same characters keep popping up and following Aloy around. After having traveled a far distance through hostile lands, it really made the world feel smaller and my accomplishments less impressive, to have the same NPCs keep popping up to join me. I do enjoy Aloy as a protagonist though. She's quite flawed and her impatience creates some entertaining moments with other characters. In summary, while I believe the story and some surrounding systems are just solid and serviceable, the combat is so excellent that for me it pulls this game up to a light A. Muck is a free survival roguelike, and it's without a doubt the most ridiculous game on my list this year. It feels like the result of a 48-hour game jam with some devs who were just making their first game and not following any rules. But somehow it ends up being really fun for a few sessions, especially if you're discovering the game with a group of some friends. Playing through your first run and learning the mechanics was an odd and enjoyable experience, as the tooltips provide almost no help. Hovering your cursor over an apple, for example, simply reads red and shiny, and some items have a max stack of exactly 69, which probably wasn't an accident. The art is super simple, but it's surprisingly clean and works for the wacky setting of the game. What kept me from playing longer is the unbelievably sharp difficulty curve and long runs with no saving. The power-ups also seemed very insignificant, which didn't give much variation across runs. For the fact that it's free, if you're ever bored, I can easily recommend giving it a few tries. It's entertaining for what it is, but it's still a bit clunky and rough around the edges for anyone taking it too seriously. Muck is a meme of a game, but it's a good meme. And for that reason, I'm going to give it a strong C. Nier Automata is a story-driven action game, and it was my favorite game of 2024. The gameplay is creative and varied, the combat is smooth and brutal, but the story is what had me absolutely absorbed into this world. In general, I feel like Japanese action or RPG-style games pack so many more mechanics and gameplay variations into their experiences compared to standard Western AAA games. Horizon was great, don't get me wrong, but you're in third-person mode from nearly start to end. In Nier, from the thrilling opening sequence, you are already switching between airship fights, top-down, side-scroller perspective, third-person combat, ARPG-style top-down combat, and are later introduced to even more ways to spice up the fights, like hacking minigames. It's super refreshing and just straight-up fun to feel the guidelines fading away on what a game can be. However, the most common third-person style combat is what you experience the most, and wow is it a treat. I felt like I was still discovering new combos dozens of hours into the game, and the animations are absolutely dripping in style. In general, the expressiveness in the character animations are beautiful. Even the walk for 2B, the protagonist, is immaculate. The boss fights are cinematic with sometimes staggering scales of destruction and size. They are engaging as well, with combat including just enough components to feel skillful without being overwhelmed by the options in front of you. The music is epic, unique, and at times haunting and otherworldly. And man, the meta incorporation of the game systems into the game itself was just so damn clever. You play as an android, and even from the opening sequences you adjust your game settings like the brightness. It's made to seem as though you're calibrating your character herself. The upgrade system is centered around finding chips, which can be slotted into your memory based on the space you have available. At the beginning, some of these design choices were confusing for me to learn, but quickly became understandable and definitely worth it. One aspect of combat that felt surprisingly underdeveloped compared to the attention given in all other aspects was the customization for your companion. Most of the game, you're fighting alongside an ally with very limited progression and options for gameplay. It didn't necessarily hinder the experience too much, but since some other games have done such a great job, like BioShock Infinite in the past with Elizabeth, or recently Atreus from God of War, it could have been cool to get a bit more help and dynamic gameplay with your partner. Unfortunately, another small misstep for me is that the combat in the world is full of weapons to discover, but I don't really see much reason to try them. All the weapons are pretty well balanced in terms of damage output, but are so resource intensive to upgrade that I felt heavily discouraged from trying out a new one once I was already invested into a different one. The resource collection selection in general isn't great since some rely on random world pickups within a given zone that only resets when you leave and return. This means the best and only way to farm some items was to run a route, pray for good RNG, then fast travel away and return to repeat it. This was pretty unfun to me, so I avoided it as often as I could. And this is a shame because again, the few times I did fight with new weapons, it was great. They all have so much character to them that I'm sad I didn't get to spend time with all of them. Another part that was a bit lacking was some aspects of the environment. Some areas were strong, but the abandoned buildings felt a bit lifeless and repetitive at times, without having any clear indication as to what its purpose was before the destruction. It's not bad by any means, but it definitely didn't stick out as a strong highlight. But now the story. I will be as vague as possible, because if I can recommend something to everyone watching, it's that you should play this game and you should go in with as little knowledge as possible. This game has so much to say about life and purpose and what it is to be a human. It's heartwarming, it's soul-crushing, it's beautiful and at times horrible. And the presentation is very interesting in a non-linear way that changes how you think about moments as new context is revealed. And you get to experience this with the characters and see them grow and learn, which makes it very easy to relate to them and build a connection. At times, the game asks a lot in terms of replaying sections, which does make up more of this game than I would have liked. But the payoffs are worth it. It feels like you're playing a full game, then the DLC, and then the sequel all in one experience. The first time the credits roll, do not stop playing. Keep going. And for the most part, I found the side quests to be really interesting as well, all helping to reinforce the themes from the main story in ways that fill you with existential dread or joy at the wonder of life. How fun. While this game does have some clear issues I outlined in my thoughts, it simply left way too positive an impression on me to not get an S. It's a messy, biased S rating, but I love this game and wanted to really convey that on this silly, oversimplified way to rank video games. Destiny 2 is a co-op looter shooter and it's my most played game of all time. After taking 2 years off, my longest break since the launch of the game in 2014, returning felt a bit like relapsing on heroin, but it also felt like reuniting with a long-lost friend. Many games in this live service genre have come and gone. Anthem, The Division, Suicide Squad, Godfall, The First Descendant, and probably many others that I'm forgetting at the moment. There are several reasons Destiny somehow manages to hit a new peak for concurrent players every year instead of dying a slow death like its peers. Despite the many frustrations with Destiny, there are a few things that are hard to deny. The surrounding technical aspects such as the art and music are incredible. The gunplay and abilities that make up the combat are also top tier, and in my opinion as well as many others, the end game content is, you guessed it, incredible. And this last point is truly the selling feature that keeps me coming back for more. I have yet to play another game that strikes the perfect balance of combat challenge and mechanical difficulty in a group co-op setting that also has the satisfying first-person AAA quality gameplay. What made me come back to Destiny was the final expansion in their Light and Dark saga, which has spanned 10 years since the game's launch. This latest DLC was definitely a narrative strong point for the game, and also introduced the most flexible build crafting system so far, with Prismatic, allowing you to mix and match abilities from different elements where you were previously limited to all arc, all solar, etc., confined within your subclass. Another huge pull is the insane FOMO from the community events. The Day 1 raid races top the charts on streaming platforms every year, and this one, Salvation's Edge, took 19 hours for the first team to clear. The boss designs, the environments, the music, and all aspects are to me the absolute peak of co-op gaming experiences. It's absolutely epic, and when the first team clears, there are announcements in the game and locked content becomes available to the rest of the community. Some of my favorite gaming memories in my life have been taking part in some of the Day 1 raid races, or even just watching as other teams compete. So until this point, I've spoken pretty highly of Destiny, so what are the issues it's facing? First and foremost, Destiny has an absolutely brutal new player experience. Introducing this game to friends is like pulling teeth, and every time they would ask me, what should I do? It would induce a strong cringe and feeling of embarrassment for even recommending the game to begin with. There are so many systems built up over so many years that are all explained pretty poorly or not at all to new players. But to top it all off is the exceptionally confusing mess of content restrictions. The game is free to play, but not really in any meaningful way. Old expansions are also constantly getting cycled out of the game into what they call the content vault, meaning sometimes you can buy something and after a year can't play it anymore. I'm actually one of the few people who understand why this is necessary, as you can't infinitely expand a game of this fidelity over time without eventually creating a 500GB monster. But sometimes these expansions leave behind fragments of content that are still relevant and pieces that aren't. So again, playing with a new friend could look like, well, tonight we're doing the new campaign, so you can't join unless you buy that. Tomorrow we're doing a generic Nightfall, so you can join. Then on Saturday we're running the raid, which is from an old expansion you'll need to spend $10 on, but the campaign is useless and they removed some of the other content. It's not relevant, but you should buy it for this. At least older content frequently goes into deep sales on Steam to play catch up, but for some of the content, the dungeons, you can only buy it in-game with their microtransaction currency. Years later, it's ridiculous that one weapon can be meta from a dungeon and I have to pay $24 to unlock it, when it just takes an hour to beat the content and the rest of the loot is worthless by now. Another thing that can make it tricky to experience the best content Destiny has to offer is not playing in a group. I personally strongly believe that having the best content be balanced for group play is a worthwhile choice that benefits the scale and quality of these experiences, but admittedly it can make solo play much less enjoyable. A sad part of the game to mention as well is how hard PvP has fallen off a cliff since its strong presence in Destiny 1. It has been made overwhelmingly clear by the developers that PvP is not meant to be taken seriously in this game. We went 2.5 years without a new map, and there was a time when things were kept so fresh with new modes, maps, and PvP was a crucial part of the game's health, especially to the streaming and content creator community. A weekend event called Trials of Osiris sees players facing off in a 3v3 format to collect wins with the ultimate pursuit of 7 wins in a row to go flawless and reach the lighthouse. This used to be a reachable goal for any stronger player. I personally did it 26 times in Destiny 1, but now would absolutely struggle if I had to do it again in recent times for Destiny 2. It's a shame, but at the same time, if PvP isn't something you care about and you can accept it for what it is like I have, it won't weigh too heavily on the total package. It's just sad to reflect on how far we've come. Back to some positives is that I believe the weapon design and creativity continues to hit new heights. Weapons that would have been considered exotic in early Destiny are now just regular legendary perks, and new exotics would have been unthinkable back then. The sheer diversity of perks and weapon types makes so many playstyles viable and lets you control the battlefield in totally different ways depending on your choice of gear. And the perk design for the most part is pretty clever, being similar in power to others but standing out in certain situations. For example, Rewind Rounds, Envious Assassin, Outlaw, Surplus, Demolitionist, and Frenzy all give reload perk benefits. But what makes them different? Rewind Rounds refills your magazine when it's empty based on the amount of bullets you hit, useful for a large target or boss fights where you won't be missing many shots. Envious Assassin partially reloads your weapon based on kills with other weapons, useful if your current one does more damage but is used less frequently so the other weapons can keep filling it from reserves. Outlaw drastically boosts reload after a critical shot kill, Frenzy gives a small increase once you've been in battle for 10 seconds, Demolitionist reloads when you throw a grenade, and the list goes on and on. For an average player, this makes minor changes to your moment-to-moment gameplay, which can add up over the scope of multiple perks on each weapon, choices of mods for your gear, and subclass. For advanced players, the differences in these weapon rolls are crucial to match the encounter and optimize your damage and efficiency. While returning to this game and playing endgame content with friends consistently provided S-tier gaming experiences, I still find it hard to always fully recommend Destiny, and the latest cause for that is such an uncertain future. Bungie recently had a bunch of layoffs, and many of their previous creative directors were moved to other projects just to be abandoned at a later date. The mismanagement of talent is disheartening, and I just hope enough of the right people are around to keep delivering strong content. And it's always an emotional whiplash with Bungie, because amidst this horrible news for both the employees and the players, they delivered what I believe to be their greatest 3-player dungeon yet. So it's hard to say where they head from here. And the final important thing Bungie must deliver on moving forward for Destiny 2 is a proper shakeup to the formula we've been given with its seasonal model. I don't think there's anything inherently disastrous with the given approach to content, and it was even praised initially, but after years the fatigue is setting in. Getting 5 minutes of lore, doing a mindless task, seasonal arena, strikes to level up, then wait till next week. It's just not doing it for players anymore, and they've promised new directions next year, but again we'll just have to see. So yeah, with Destiny, you just never know, but as long as they keep delivering raids at the level they always have been, I will likely keep returning to play them over time. When Destiny is at its best, you're slaying bosses with your friends on otherworldly planets, but at its worst, it's repetitive, frustrating, and unintuitive. It's really hard to give a rating, but I'm gonna average out everything and leave it in a B. Another really quick one I played this past year was We Were Here Together Expeditions. The We Were Here series is a great collection of co-op puzzle games. I've played them all so far except the latest, and I've always thoroughly enjoyed them. They are usually between 6 to 8 hours to beat, but Expeditions only took me and my friend about an hour to clear, so keep that in mind. But for the $5 price tag, I think that can be a fair amount of content as long as you set your expectations accordingly. The puzzle design as usual was quite varied, and I found it had a good mix of puzzles that were logical and others less so but relied on extremely precise communication. There were also some time-sensitive elements introduced which added heightened stress to the encounters, and I think it was a nice addition to make thoughtful puzzle solving feel a bit more urgent at times. Another cool new feature was tiered rewards and solutions so that you could solve things correctly but not perfectly. This allows for a bit of replayability, as you may stumble through to a bronze or silver solution and want to go back for gold. However, I found the extra surrounding content a bit underwhelming and frankly annoying, as long sections monologued about friendship. It seemed like they were just padding the runtime and repeating themselves with not much substance at all. The whole place is in an amusement park, so not much variety to the environments, but again, understandable for a standalone experience. I'm always amazed by the game design and creativity needed to design challenging but fair two-player puzzles. I think this game can absolutely be worth one night of fun with a friend, but since there are so many stronger entries I would recommend first, and since the surrounding content like the transitionary stages were pretty poorly done, I'm just gonna leave it as a strong C. Celeste is a wonderful pixel art precision platformer that demands flawless execution on your mechanics but rewards you with thoughtful storytelling, pretty scenery, and a catchy 8-bit soundtrack. The controls are so simple, just move, jump, and dash, yet the game does such a great job to never let these things get boring by introducing fun new mechanics to every section of the game. The pacing felt absolutely perfect to me, as each stage had just enough time to develop the mechanics and required deeper thinking to your approaches and more precision to your timing, but never felt so long that it overstayed its welcome and became stale. Each section truly did feel like a masterclass of pushing the limits to what was possible, given the confines of the movement abilities and environment factors previously established. The checkpoints are constant, and with each short jumping puzzle you're forced into a battle of iterative progress as you inch closer towards a successful completion. Some of my favorites were the time trial encounters, which felt extra stressful from the frantic music that was often more upbeat and soothing. The initial story prompt isn't very heavy-handed at all, just a girl climbing a mountain, but as the story progresses, I found myself getting more and more invested into Madeline's journey as it deepens to introduce heavy introspective themes of mental health. On the surface, it can be an odd clash to have such playful gameplay set the stage for the subject matter, but the metaphor of the mountain grew to fit perfectly. And the tone was still sweet, with heartwarming moments between characters and funny menu tips like, be proud of your death count, the more you die, the more you're learning. As I played, I found myself enjoying every puzzle and constantly looking forward to the next narrative beat, jumping mechanic, and even the visual environment. Changes from a harsh mountain that feels frigid yet mystical to interiors that felt warm yet haunted was always very enjoyable. If I had to say anything negative about Celeste, it's that there are so many extra harder puzzles to collect strawberries, the game's bonus collectible, but I didn't feel there was enough incentive to complete them. I would often give a few tries, but if it stopped my momentum of the main story too aggressively, I would just move on, which was a shame since a sizable amount of content is contained in these strawberry puzzles. I'm gonna give Celeste a strong A. I think the only thing holding it back from S is probably a personal preference for the genre, and nothing groundbreaking in terms of innovation. However, it's still an excellent game and deserves a spot high on the tier list. Gris is a stunning indie platformer that feels like you're watching a hand-drawn animation take place in real time. It was genuinely mesmerizing to me at the start that the visuals were responding to my inputs. You can pause at any time, and there's a good chance you can turn the screen into a desktop wallpaper. And while the art style is beautiful, the creative choices for presentation are also super engaging. The camera is very dynamic and will stay close at times to capture intimate and emotional moments, but other times pan out aggressively to reveal sweeping vistas while masterfully conveying a sense of depth and scale despite the 2D aesthetic. The music is soothing and serene, but has hints of mystery and sadness, which match the setting really effectively. In general, the sound design was a joy to take in. As I walked through a barren desert area, the music died out and left me with nothing but the sandy footsteps and rushing wind, filling me with a feeling of emptiness for this setting. Despite the painterly style, there's a tangible weight to the world, as platforms you step on will bend beneath your weight, and rocks can be smashed to bits with the right amount of force. The creatures also seamlessly breathed life into the world, as their designs were uniquely interwoven with nature. The way they would sometimes stop moving when you walked by them truly felt like a Toy Story moment, where you're just an intruder in the world who witnessed something mystical you shouldn't have. The game was very light on gameplay for nearly the first half of the game, more of a walking simulator. I wanted to draw a comparison to the previous review I did of Celeste, since they're both side-scrollers with platforming elements, but I think they have a very different appeal. Celeste is a game through and through. Constant challenges and rewards with explicit storytelling. Gris almost feels more like an experience. I don't think there's much replay value, and the story of grief is felt, but it's not in your face. At one point while I was playing, my girlfriend asked me, "Are you having fun?" which forced me to think. I knew I was enjoying myself, but it also felt wrong to say I was having fun. Does watching a profound, tragic movie feel fun? I don't think that's the case, so it really depends on what you're looking for with a game. I know I felt a range of emotions that were positive or fulfilling to me, like the waves of relaxation from the sounds, or the sense of wonder as I explored new areas the world had to offer. With that said, the puzzles definitely grew with complexity over the course of the game, and required some more thoughtful approaches near the end for sure. For what it tries to be, I believe Gris perfectly achieves it, and I'm giving it an A. Balatro is a wacky poker roguelike that has been controversially nominated for Game of the Year in 2024. I think one of its immediate appeals is it nails the easy-to-learn, hard-to-master game design with a super quick, intuitive tutorial that drops you right into the action, but has you continuing to develop your strategies for hours to come. The concept of the game is to play poker hands and beat increasingly challenging blinds, but as you do this, you collect jokers and various modifiers or upgrades to give you gameplay advantages. Things like a straight only needing 4 cards to be playable, or all number cards being worth 2 times their value, and other things like that. And wow, is it ever addicting. Each round is so quick that you always want to play a full run to its completion without putting the game down. Balatro makes it really easy to risk everything on an early strategy that's hard to pull off, but when you fail, you can jump right back into another run 5 minutes later without getting too frustrated. There are around 150 joker cards, 4 deck card modifiers, over a dozen passive vouchers, 22 consumable tarot cards, 18 spectral upgrade cards, and more. The randomness of each round really does feel out of control as an early player, but the expression of skill as you learn enough viable strategies to adapt to anything the RNG throws at you is what makes it so fun. I can play a wildly successful run entirely centered around playing full house hands, but with no guarantee I can mimic it on the next run, so I have to be ready to see what other cards I can synergize. And when things are working well, you see the multipliers start adding up at the end of your round, and it's so satisfying every time. Perhaps one of the most impressive things is that the entire soundtrack is 19 minutes long, yet seems infinitely replayable, and I found myself still nodding my head along to it after dozens of hours playing. I think one of the weaknesses to me though is it's kinda hard to call it a must-play game or a masterpiece. It's near flawless game design for the card roguelike genre, but the setting itself does no favors to the spectacle aspect. Slay the Spire in terms of gameplay at a macro level is quite similar. You're building a deck of cards, synergizing your abilities, and progressing through levels with increasing difficulty. However, I found myself liking Slay the Spire much more for superficial reasons. It feels cooler to kill a boss than beat a high score hand. Even smaller things like visiting a merchant, who is a character with silly lines of dialogue in a simple shop, made it feel much more grounded than just a new screen for buying cards in Balatro. It definitely has mobile game appeal, for better or worse, and as fun as it was for the first while, I ran out of excitement and a strong pull to keep playing after a handful of successful runs. This is one I'm conflicted on for ranking. I think I have a lot of bias against the game's style. It was really solid, but due to the lack of peripherals, I'm gonna give it just a strong B, although it's close to being a light A. Hyperlight Drifter is a pixel art adventure game that had me hooked from its hypnotic intro cutscene. The tone was mysteriously dreamlike, and the sounds were dramatic and atmospheric. And that's a word I'll struggle to avoid overusing when I share my thoughts on this game, because while there's much else to enjoy, I think its most compelling aspect is the atmosphere. The game does very little to hold your hand or guide you, and the world design is easy to get lost in at first. Even the UIs for things like the map seem hard to read, but as you progress through this broken world and its strikingly colorful levels, things start to make sense, and your gain in confidence is an enjoyable part of the mastery. There were, however, some times where I felt it took one step too far in the lack of readability for the style of the game. The map, for example, updates the player position way too vaguely, to the point of being nearly incorrect of where I am in the world. Another one is sometimes having the perspective make it hard to tell where I can and cannot go. I also found some of the default controls a bit clunky, but tweaking the settings improved that somewhat. Getting used to exploring is worth it, and one of the most skillful aspects of the game, since the world is so densely overflowing with secrets, bullets to reward your curiosity. As for movement, there is a pretty fun dash mechanic that allows you to keep momentum and chain dashes with good timing, which was an engaging minigame as you traverse the levels. One thing I think was lackluster was the gameplay variety across the combat zones. There wasn't nearly enough to separate them strongly in terms of combat or mechanics, which meant that apart from visual style, the sections got a bit repetitive towards the end. The combat encounters are simple, but require some thought to your approach so you don't get overwhelmed. There are some upgrades, but I found them very hit and miss. One to deflect bullets was cool, but another one that adds a bomb to your kit I never remembered to use, since it was pretty weak and I only got it about a third through the game, and my muscle memory couldn't adapt it into my combat routines. In general, the combat was serviceable and not bad, but definitely not a strong selling point to me. Music was another fantastic aspect that added to the immersion. It's very otherworldly and uses lots of distorted electronic sounds to create a mesmerizing result. The story is very much vibes and ambience, so there's not a ton to pick apart, but some of the visual imagery, like the protagonist coughing up blood, really drives home an uneasy feeling effectively. I think Hyperlight Drifter is a unique experience that excels in some aspects, but is held back in others, like its gameplay variety and depth. For those reasons, I'm gonna give it a solid B. It Takes Two is a casual co-op adventure puzzle game that I think absolutely nails its uniquely accessible experience. Although its puzzles and mechanics are never extremely deep, it easily makes up for this lack of complexity with a sheer overwhelming variety of new ideas over the course of the game, which never lets the gameplay get stale. I think it's a rare case of a game being made to appeal to the widest audience possible and actually doing a good job. The difficulty is just enough to keep an experienced player engaged, but at the same time it's well within the grasp of someone less skilled. My brother, who plays games a lot, was able to play with my dad, who doesn't at all, and both came away enjoying their time. Same goes for me and my girlfriend. Although I do have to say, the more intense sections that relied on mechanics for aiming and fighting felt a bit floaty or unresponsive at times, which could be a bit frustrating as someone accustomed to playing lots of games that specialize in their polished combat. The unique tools given to each player are also handled really well to force seamless cooperation and block any one player from dominating the experience. For example, at one point you have to shoot wasps, which requires the first player covering it with goo and the second detonating the goo. If both players just had a standard gun, the better player could easily control the encounter while player 2 watches. But here, It Takes Two ensures everyone gets their share of the action. The story in the game was something I wasn't really attached to at the beginning, but the directions it took were really unexpected in a good way. For a game about a divorce, it didn't take itself seriously at all for 95% of the time, and that made the few moments of meaning more impactful. Although some definitely fell flat, and not all the humor was for me, on the whole it was a pleasant experience, but the plot itself and the adventure aspects were what had me most entertained. The environments you get to explore are a great part of the game as well. They are wonderfully crafted and creative twists on fun childhood experiences pushed to the limit. Playrooms are transformed into ball pit oceans, cardboard castles, and galactic stations, like the imagination of a kid brought to life, and they are absolutely packed with secret games to discover, which felt like an absolute labor of love from the developers. Who knows how much time they spent putting a fully fleshed out shuffleboard minigame with multiple stages in a hidden ice cave arena. It was ridiculous, but for those 3 minutes I played, the passion was tangible from making the choice to have so many of these fun small experiences. I've given it a lot of praise, but I want to take a second and ground it with a few caveats. I didn't think any single aspect of the game is enough to really push it into a masterpiece category. The gameplay, while fun and varied, definitely doesn't have the greatest puzzles or the greatest combat or movement. The environments are great, but don't stand out as a reason worth playing by itself. Same for the story. However, it does a really solid job in all these places and is a perfect game to play in co-op with someone of nearly any gaming experience. I think I have some bias against it as a genre because I tend to prefer games that can go really deep into one aspect, like the incredible puzzles from a Portal game or the amazing combat and movement from Risk of Rain. So for those reasons, I'm gonna give it a really strong B. Enshrouded is an open-world co-op survival RPG that does a bit of everything to create a very enjoyable experience. The introduction to the game was relatively smooth for a complex survival game with lots of crafting, but I found progression to be intuitive from the start. I'm probably going to be drawing comparisons to Valheim a lot throughout this review since it's the last big survival game that I sunk a ton of hours into, and I think highlighting key differences and similarities can be helpful to illustrate the strengths and weaknesses of this game. One key distinction is the choice to have a handcrafted world that is the same every time you play. Lots of survival games have randomly generated maps, and I think both come with their own appeal. One of the disadvantages of a handmade world is the lack of replayability. Starting a new world and exploring can always be a fun part to games like Minecraft or Valheim, since you'll never get the same adventure twice. However, one strong benefit of the map in Enshrouded is the level of detail you can carefully build into different settings. Small, unassuming farming towns might have a bookshelf in the basement with a secret button, and next thing you know, you're making your way through a sprawling dungeon network below the city. I think they can pack a lot more balance, environmental storytelling, and cool scripted moments than a random world, and I found the exploration to be really fun because of this. And the world is truly massive, with more being added each major update. Getting to new biomes and exploring for the first time with friends was an awesome experience. Another design choice is that the questing and overall journal system is a bit more heavy-handed. A downside is that the exploration and progression can feel less organic, but I found the clear directions made it a very easy game to put down for a week and then return to with a strong sense of purpose. When lots of the driving momentum for a game is your own goals and knowledge of the context on an abstract mission, it can be really challenging to pick it back up. The way quests are handled in multiplayer is also done really well. There's a concept of Embervale quests, which are tied to the world, and Flameborn, which are tied to the player. If you miss an Embervale quest, you can choose to switch modes and allow yourself to complete any quests you missed if your friends beat something without you. In general, the quality of life features and communication from the devs really sets the bar for community engagement. They have a detailed roadmap with features to expect and allow heavy input from players to vote on the most desired new mechanics. I think one of the best parts that makes Enshrouded so enjoyable and successful as an RPG is the scope of gameplay there is to enjoy. The skill trees allow you to drastically change your playstyle from being a mage, tank, archer, assassin, knight, and more. You have to mine, farm crops, explore, build bases, fight bosses, there's jumping puzzles, you can explore castles, dungeons, mountains, you rescue villagers, raise animals, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some more there is to do. There's just so damn much, and it's all pretty solid that the variety can keep you hooked and immersed in this fantasy world. The base building is one aspect that is specifically great for immersion and fun, as the level of detailing available through different types of structures and ornaments is incredible. It was super enjoyable to build out a village with my friends as we progressed with our time through the game. I do, however, have a few important criticisms. The first is the way the game restricts movement into higher leveled zones. Enshrouded's main gameplay gimmick is the Shroud, which is a toxic cloud that covers areas of the map and puts a timer on your screen when you enter. When the timer hits 0, you die. And for the most part, it's an okay mechanic. Some added stress in certain areas is fun. But the game uses this concept of red shrouded areas to block passage entirely based on the level of your base. Basically, kill the boss in your area before you can move on to here. I really don't like this restriction of exploration, because I think part of the fun to open world games is letting you stumble into an area you shouldn't be in, feel the threat when you get smacked down by something twice your level or size, and return later. Or better yet, choosing to ignore all the warnings and use your skill to overpower it and be heavily rewarded. But the problem here is actually twofold, since the reason they have to have the red shroud is because so much loot is tied to chests that can be farmed without trials of combat. YouTube videos and guides encourage building your base near a rare chest and just flying in to open it, then resetting the server to get good drops. There are some good examples in the game of long, challenging dungeons with progression gated by combat encounters and a big reward at the end. This should be the norm, not the exception. Chests should be locked until the area is cleared, or loot should drop on kill from tough enemies. Once this is fixed, Red Mist should at most have a reduced timer to make it hard but not impossible to explore beyond your safety. Another way to lean into the RPG aspects of the game and reward varied play is to give experience for more mechanics. They have experience for mining, which I think is great, but what about chopping trees, cooking, or harvesting plants? I could easily spend an extended play session harvesting wood to build a base, making and planting farms, crafting potions, and cooking food while my friends are away fighting. At the end of the night, they'll be a higher level and showered in loot, while I have nothing to show for my efforts in terms of progression. I'm very happy with combat being the ultimate focus, but games like Stardew and Co-op do a good job of letting people lean a bit into their roles and get extra skills to favor their playstyles. And lastly is stronger gameplay modifiers on armor. At the time of writing this, I haven't experienced everything the game has to offer, but I'm hoping there will be more weapons or sets of armor that have that exotic factor to make it feel distinct. I haven't so far registered the name of any gear I've gotten because they they all feel like replaceable and marginally better versions of the piece that came before them. My new fire wand is 22 power. My last fire wand was 20 power. There are unique perks like mana regen on hit or frost armor, but I'm talking about an armor set that gives you an extra jump, or a weapon with a completely unique attack animation that you have to charge up, or something like that. Leaning on weapon design philosophy from Destiny or Elden Ring to give more character to the loot pool would be awesome. So I started strong and finished with some complaints, but this feedback truly comes from a place of love for the game, and the hope to see it continue to improve and perform well. There's already so much to enjoy here, and with where I'm at now, I'm gonna give it a strong B, but I think with a bit more polish, and if it continues the rate of improvement it currently enjoys, it will be an A in no time. Well, if you've made it through to the end, congrats and thanks for sticking with me. This was a long one with a ton of yapping. I make these videos for two reasons. One is that I like to remember my time with each game, and saving these little collections of thoughts allows me to look back and quickly relive how I felt when I first experienced playing them. Years later, I might not appreciate as much how special or unique certain aspects were, but by writing it down and recording it, I get to more thoughtfully consume and reflect on these games. And second, importantly, is that I hope it can reach an audience and inspire them to try out some new games or help narrow down their backlog. I barely bought any games this year and have just been working through my massive library across multiple platforms. I watched tons of videos just like these to curate my wishlist and decide what to play. I still have around 40 games across my various libraries to play, so I'm sure I'll be covered for next year as well. These include Baldur's Gate, Bastion, Inside, Crosscode, Control, Soma, Return of the Obra Dinn, and many more. My goal is to finally work up the courage to play some of my horror games as well, so we'll see how that goes. I look forward to seeing you again next year.